Hello everyone, I'm Rohan and welcome to the webinar, A Day in the Life of a Contract, Safeguarding Value Through Improved Contract Management, brought to you by Zycus in association with IACCM. So I would like to start introducing today's speakers. We have Tim Cummins, President and CEO at IACCM, Brandt, Rydell, Assistant General Counsel at ERCOT, and Richard Waugh, he is VP Corporate Development at Zycus. So, as this is a live webinar, we do welcome you to submit questions using the Q&A panel, and we'll stop for Q&A in the end, and we'll try to address as many questions as possible. So, without further ado, I would pass it on to Tim.
Well, thank you very much, Rohan. And so, with that, if we may, I think we'll move forward and we'll go to our first chart on the day in the life of the contract. And Richard, I know we've got a very nice picture here of a very traditional sort of contract with a quill pen. I guess this is the old world that we came from and we're trying to get well beyond, eh?
Yes, it's hard to show a digital signature.
But we certainly know that that's one of the areas we need to move towards. So let's move forward, if we may, to our first sort of substantive chart, where we start talking about really the pre-contract world. In a sense, I suppose it's the preparation. And a couple of the big issues we hear a lot about from our members, and I know that Richard and Brandt are both going to give some further commentary on this, but one, of course, is the whole question of the timing of involvement. And frequently we hear from members that say, if only we'd been involved earlier, or if only we could engage earlier, we could bring so much more value to the process. I'm going to make a couple of comments on that because I think it's a really important point, and the evidence does point to the fact that you're right. Those of you who say, if only we could be involved earlier, absolutely. And there are a couple of, I think, primary issues that come from this. One, certainly the timing of involvement of the contracts or commercial team, including, maybe a legally driven team, it may be belong to another function, no matter where it is, that early engagement does give better assurance that we're actually considering carefully what business terms are really needed, that we are structuring conversations in a much more intelligent way. And the evidence suggests from again, research work that's been done, the evidence suggests that if commercial teams are involved earlier in the process, it does take a bit longer in the setup phase, but it dramatically shortens the negotiation and contract development phase. The frequency and the amount of rework, for example, is substantially reduced. So organizations that have actually undertaken proper process revision are finding that they can cut the overall cycle time from inception of bid through to contract signature, typically by between 15 and 25% by getting better and earlier involvement of those resources. So those of you who thought that would be a benefit to the business, you're absolutely right. It is a benefit to the business. Now, the other point that we've got here is around scope and goals. And in a sense, that's, I suppose, somewhat related to the subject of timing of involvement. Far too often, we finish up with a situation where the scope and goals are not well defined. And I think we have a number of unfortunate instances here. Firstly, scope and goals, our research shows, is the number one source of subsequent claim and dispute. So very clearly, if we're trying to reduce the probability of risk and trying to maximize the chances of our contracts going well, then having real clarity over what it is we're trying to achieve and what scope we're committing to or seeking is really important. Requirement definition is often a real problem. And again, very often the right commercial resources are not truly involved in that definition or the capturing of the scope and the goals for the contract, which then of course means that very often we're having to perhaps be more risk averse in order to cover the riskiness of uncertainty. Richard, I know you've got some, Brandt, I know you've got some thoughts, I think, on these topics, and maybe I could just pass to you for a moment for any comments you might have.
Oh, sure. Now, harkening back to the prior slide with the old-fashioned contract with the quill pen, one of the reasons why ERCOT was interested in moving towards a contract lifecycle management tool was, even in this day and age, we seem to still be so paper-driven, so reliant on manual processes, that we really were looking for a tool to bring us forward. Now, with respect to the requirements and the timing and scope and goals, it is really key. From ERCOT's perspective, we have our procurement contract administration team, which does a good job of engaging our business units early on in the process to help fully form those requirements. It's very beneficial to me as an attorney that by the time the contract process gets to me, that those business terms and conditions are finalized to a large extent, that the less time I need to go back and have any pushback or questioning on the business terms, the better I can focus on my expertise, which is in the legal terms and conditions. Of course, the best practice is to eliminate all the ambiguities up front and to flesh out all the requirements as best we can, again, to mitigate any future risks.
And all too often, of course, I think we have situations where one of the challenges for procurement is the extent to which they enable discussion between the supplier and the end-user community, particularly as we move into more of a services and solutions world. And it's, of course, one of the things that many in procurement have been taught to do is really to try and limit that supplier interaction with the business. But on the other hand, our experience is that increasingly they need to think about themselves as acting as facilitators of those discussions, because if we haven't had adequate understanding of requirement from a user perspective and capability from a supplier perspective, we have, of course, created an environment of real risk. And I know we're going to come back later to the ideas around where technology can really help us in streamlining that and maintaining good control over the process. So perhaps we can move forward to our next component, if you like, in this early phase of the contract, and that is the selection of the right type of agreement. And after this one, Richard, maybe we can flip to you for some comments. The reason we've got this one here is because, again, the research evidence shows that, remarkably enough, it is not infrequent for organizations to actually have quite significantly wrong contract structures for the nature of what they're trying to achieve. And I think one of the big challenges here is that most organizations, for reasons of efficiency, want to try to impose standard terms and conditions. We know that over 92% of the IACCM members have standard forms of contract, and of course, whether they're buy side or sell side, they try as much as they can to get away with it, because at least in principle, it offers them a level of efficiency and reduced risk. But in practice, of course, if we've created an agreement form that is not really appropriate to the nature of the relationship we're trying to structure, for example, maybe we're using a general product and services acquisition agreement where what we're trying to do is actually license a piece of software, then that is going to cause a whole load of downstream problems. Now, I know that you're going to tell us, of course, that technology can really help us on this one, Richard.
Absolutely, Tim. The right type of agreement, as you mentioned, is so critical. And, from a tool perspective, that can first start with, having the intelligence built in such that based on the category or the supplier relationship that the system, the software itself suggests to the user the right type of agreement to begin with. The other thing we hear from customers is that there are actually multiple agreements that they need to manage. It's a hierarchy of agreements that may include multiple different types, starting with a master services agreement, as well as various sub-agreements or statements of work, non-disclosure, etc. So the screenshot here and the tooltip here is being able to organize a hierarchy of agreements, link those together, so that at the end of the day you've got that one version of the truth, one place to go to see all the related agreements for a particular relationship with a vendor.
And I'm presuming that quite a number of your clients are also really using a portfolio of templates with sort of better guidance materials to really help people to make a better selection in the beginning.
Absolutely. Starting from the get-go, finding the right type of agreement, having the intelligence to guide that user so that they don't get frustrated and fumble around. They can find the right agreement as a starting point.
Because we know, of course, that if they get frustrated, one of the tendencies on the part of business units, because they want to go the path of least resistance, they very often don't want to have to run the gamut of getting all these reviews and approvals done, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the temptation to them very often is to pick up whatever they were last given and hope that it roughly fits. And, of course, it may well not fit. So if we can then move forward to our next chart, because that does actually take us into the review and approval challenge, which is another of those that we frequently hear from our members, is not only challenging but becoming more so. And let's just explore that for a moment. I think the review and approval process has always been fraught with difficulty. There's a question of which stakeholders need to be involved, whether they all must be involved every time, or whether there can be assumptions around levels of approval. But the situation has become steadily worse because as the issues around risk and the complexity of many of the deals in which we engage today, we're seeing a growth of the number of specialists that need to be involved. Brandt, we could certainly take a legal function as a good example. I mean, certainly back early in my career, if I involved a lawyer at all, it was one. Today, you might well need a specialist in data protection, a specialist in intellectual property, and a specialist in various other regulatory areas that your contract might be affecting. So and as I say, the legal review is just one example of that. So most organizations have seen a substantial increase in the numbers of people who are potentially in that review and approval cycle, and that, in fact, has led to an average lengthening of cycle times around review and approval over the last 5 years. So we've got management that expects business to be accelerating, that thinks that things like contract review and approval should be speeding up, and the reality is it's slowing down. And I'm sure that's going to be an area you're going to want to touch on in a minute, Richard, because I would certainly agree with you. One of the critical components of addressing that problem is, without question, technology. But if I may, before we jump to the review and approval, I'll just cover quickly the second topic, which is around risk allocation. And this one is very much about how do we actually build sustainable and successful trading relationships. And as I mentioned in the previous chart, very often organizations tend to try to impose their standard terms and refer a more powerful party. One of the regular practices is let's just try and place a lot of risk onto the counterparty. That really isn't very smart. And as we have increasingly, as I mentioned before, service and solutions forms of contract, we really do need to think much more substantively about what behaviors risk allocation induces. And again, drawing on the research, it's very clear that if we, for example, want to drive continuous improvement, if we want openness, honesty, integrity, certainly if we ever want innovation, then the way that we allocate risk has a substantial impact upon the way our counterparty behaves. So it's another of those growing areas where maturing businesses are understanding that they need not only to have standard templates, but they also need to have a series of pre-approved fallback positions.
We just lost Tim there. Richard, if you could take it over, we can continue from here.
Sure, that sounds good, Rohan. We were just talking about fallback positions. In this case, I'll be the fallback host and moderator. And I think, Brandt, this is a good point to get your perspective on terms and conditions, the importance of getting standardization around what is the default, what are the appropriate or approved alternate or fallback clauses, and make sure the right clauses are in those agreements as they're being structured.
Sure. Well, ERCOT falls very much into that 92% figure that Tim mentioned of entities that seek to impose their standard terms and conditions. We have a master services agreement, which we probably use in a similar percentage of engagements. Probably over 90% of our engagements we use our standard master services agreement. And to your point about the hierarchy of contracts, we have our master service agreement, then a series of statements of work under each master services agreement, and of course NDAs in other situations as well. As Tim mentioned, it's not a one-size-fits-all type agreement. There's some things that aren't captured in there, and he mentioned the challenges of software license agreements. Very often we're using the other party's paper when it comes to agreements such as that, and there will always be one-offs and ad hoc agreements where our master services agreement is not well suited, and we're then negotiating off of the counterparty's form. Now, on the as our master agreement, we sought to refine it here over recent years because we were very much of the school of pushing as much risk as possible on the counterparty, which then led to increased negotiation, increased cycle time, and we've tried to moderate our position to have our first foray, our first agreement that's offered to the other party to be as mutually beneficial as possible, so that we can reduce unnecessary back and forth in negotiation. Of course, there's always going to be some circumstances where there's going to be differing opinions, and a certain amount of negotiation on legal terms and conditions will come into play. And we have historically had certain fallback positions that we've kept in our pocket to pull out in certain circumstances. And one thing about the contract lifecycle management tool that we've been working on is to have a more formalized process, because to this point it was, say in my case, I would have certain language I could fall back to, but again, sometimes there's some nuances involved, and it takes a bit more than a standard fallback position. And even then, we hadn't formalized to the extent where we'll be able to with with the tool to have this library of clauses to be pulled up and inserted on a much more efficient and economical basis.
Thanks, Brandt. Great insights there. So it sounds like a little bit more of a balancing of the risk allocation point, and drives towards standardization as much as possible, recognizing that there may always be those nuances, but more standardization is kind of the overarching goal, as we've seen. Just from the tool standpoint then, on this topic of terms and conditions, often it's a matter of helping the users, the functional business users, find the most appropriate terms and conditions that need to be included in their agreements. And it starts here with that clause library that was already mentioned and having it be searchable. So in the example that we're showing, a user is doing a simple keyword search for payment terms to find what are the most appropriate and approved clauses to include for the type of agreement that they're structuring for payment terms. And here they would have, by category, a standard term as well as an alternate or fallback that they can use. So you're giving as much flexibility as possible to the user within that overarching goal of achieving standardization. So the other things that the tools enable here, providing automated suggestions to the user for what's the most appropriate type of clause based on the type of agreement, the category, or the supplier relationship with the contracting party. And Brandt, you mentioned the fact that for many different types of agreements, especially you mentioned software license agreements as a software provider, we're always glad to hear that customers want to use our paper. But in that context, the tool needs to be flexible enough to import third-party paper, such as formats like Microsoft Word, but then apply what's called a fuzzy matching logic to incorporate that text from a third-party paper into the contractual components, the metadata that's assigned to that contract within the tool itself. So you're able to accommodate that third-party structure. The other point that we hit on earlier was making sure that various stakeholders are engaged up front and at the right points in the process. It's also important that they're not over-engaged. So certain stakeholders shouldn't have to review every clause, for example, in an agreement, but the intelligence built into the software actually automatically selects the most relevant stakeholders for a particular clause that need to review and approve, and send them email notifications and initiate then the approval workflow process for them to approve that particular clause being included. So it's just some of the ways where automation can help drive that goal of standardization.
Yeah, those are great examples, Richard. We're finding that more and more legal and contracts teams are under very real pressure to demonstrate to management their economic value, that just doing a good job of putting contracts in place is really no longer enough. Is it really the best contract? Is it really delivering, a better bottom line return as a result of their work? And of course, things like these fallback terms and so on, the proper controlled use of the fallbacks is becoming more critically important in demonstrating that, because of course this begins to give us the ability to make intelligent trades in the contracting process that actually do lead to better bottom line results. So I think what you were just talking about there are great examples. So maybe we can move forward to another piece of our day in the life, and that is as we need to reach the phase of negotiation. And we've actually just issued our 2013-14 edition of our annual study of the most frequently negotiated terms, and our report suggests that indeed there is a growth of development, I suppose, would be a fair term to use, in moving towards a more collaborative model of negotiation, and that the long-expressed wish to move to a win-win type approach is at last beginning to become a little bit more of a reality. I wouldn't want to overstate it, because unfortunately still the most frequently negotiated terms are dominated by things like liabilities and indemnities and intellectual property rights, which, when we think them through, unfortunately don't bring much in the way of that economic value or that collaboration. But what is encouraging is that the dominance, if you like, is reducing, and we are seeing negotiation teams with much more focus on a lot of the key business terms, which include things like the scope and goals that we've mentioned before, but also around many of the principles in which communications are going to occur, or much greater clarity of the responsibilities of the parties. Now, all of this, of course, is driven by this decision over style and leadership. What is the approach we're going to take? It's all very nice for us to say, oh yes, we like win-win, but if we haven't actually structured and planned our negotiation to cover the subjects and to take the approaches that will result in win-win, we're likely to finish up with the rather more traditional power-driven discussions and a large focus on risk allocation. That's also, of course, more likely if, again, the right people haven't been involved from the inception of the negotiation. And what I think many organizations still fail to understand is that negotiation, in truth, begins usually long before the RFP is issued. And again, if you haven't got the commercial team somewhat engaged, at least in trying to understand the nature of the relationship you're trying to achieve, the probability is that whatever negotiations occur are going to be relatively poorly structured and are not going to achieve the sort of style or leadership that is needed. Which leads us to the second point around the team itself, and that again, as we touched on, is an increasingly tricky area in that with the growth of the number of stakeholders, there are many people who certainly feel they have an interest, but the question is, of course, how many can you really afford to involve? And I think this, again, is where technology is creating some intriguing possibilities, because there is the difference between, I suppose, the physical negotiation that we tend to think of in the past, and which this picture of a table tends to imply, versus the reality of much of today's negotiation, which is increasingly virtual. And here, again, the intelligent and imaginative use of technology is something that really does have to play into our planning. So, Brandt, you may like to, again, report your experiences, I suppose, in these two topics.
Sure. What we try to do at ERCOT is, at the RFP stage, attach our standard terms and conditions, our services agreement, so the prospective vendors have the benefit of reviewing those and making known any issues they may have with respect to our standard terms at their response to the proposal stage. Now, the reality is, in my experience, those terms are given short shrift. There's more focus on getting the work than responding with lots of proposed changes to our standard terms. So more often than not, the pushback on any terms comes much later in the process. Fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, most of the business terms have been ironed out by the time the contract reaches my desk. That our procurement contract administration professionals have worked with our business users and done a good job at identifying the requirements, the milestones and deliverables that may be associated with a prospective statement of work. So by the time it reaches me, I can then again focus on the legal terms and conditions and incorporating the business terms as have been negotiated at that point into say a statement of work. Now, one thing that we hear quite a bit from the business users again is cycle time frustration from the time they decide they need a good or service to the time that it is actually procured through a formal contract. Can be sometimes a rather lengthy process. And one of the frustrations, I think, for the business users in most cases is once they initiate it, to them it goes into a black hole and they have no visibility as to the status of the contract, absent me giving routine updates or them checking in, which is one of the real benefits that we at ERCOT see at a contract lifecycle management tool. Creating the greater transparency for the business user, I think is going to be a real benefit for us. Again, because it eliminates a lot of those questions. The contract or the request is initiated for a contract, and then they may not hear another thing about it until several weeks later when the contract is fully negotiated and signed at that point. So again, that's a real benefit I think we see of the contract lifecycle management tool.
And of course, the other side of that is that you can begin to track some of those cycle times better, can't you, and begin to see whether there are repetitive hold-up points that need to be addressed, which may be a resourcing issue. It may be, I was talking with an organization the other day where its cycle times had lengthened, and they realized it was directly linked to some new pricing algorithms they'd introduced, which had introduced considerable more complexity and delay. So then, of course, the business was at least informed and was able to make some decisions about whether, in fact, those algorithms were correct or could they be simplified. So, again, the more that you can begin to gain visibility into the process through that automation and the results, the analysis that comes from it, the more you can tackle some of those very real issues of dissatisfaction and potential business disadvantage, of course, if you can't get them right. So, Richard, I'm sure you've got some light to throw on all of this.
I do, Tim, and picking up on Brandt's point about user frustration, not having visibility to the status in the overall contracting process, that's certainly something an automated tool addresses. And in particular, it seems like at this negotiation stage, that's where that pain kind of rises to the surface and is the greatest, in large part because there's so many different versions floating around as the contract is negotiated back and forth between the buying organization and the contracting party. So this is, in particular, is a stage at which the technology can be very effective. And one of the things that comes into play here is when you're engaging that third party, although all of the negotiation can be done within the tool itself, a fact of just reality and pragmatism is that in some cases, those contracting parties, the suppliers in particular, may be more comfortable going through the redlining process in something like Microsoft Word. So that's where the export and import capabilities within the tool are so key. And as was mentioned earlier, in fact, in some cases, you may be starting with third-party paper, so uploading from Word. And then as the process continues and there's this back and forth negotiation with the suppliers, that's where you get into the different versions. So here we're showing a side-by-side comparison, so you can see exactly what was changed, and from an audit trail standpoint, by whom, in which version in the process. You can kind of get that head-to-head comparison. Just look at the delta as you're analyzing and maintaining version control throughout. Very key factor that we see from a technology standpoint.
Well, now, of course, we've done our negotiation. We've got, hopefully, the right contract. We've thought through the terms and conditions, risk allocations, and everything else, and we've come to a point of contract signature. You touched on electronic signature, Richard. It isn't actually on our list here, but it is, of course, one of those important elements that can significantly help with reducing cycle time, but interestingly can significantly also help in contracts not getting lost. We found that the propensity for contracts to disappear into a hole is far greater in signed agreements than it is in electronically signed agreements. So certainly that's an important point for people to consider. But moving on from the electronic signature question, I think we then get into these other critical areas of the transition, if you like, of now it's signed. Okay, that's great, but then somebody needs to pick up the responsibilities, the obligations associated with performance. And that, again, is where things frequently go wrong. Contracts are often not designed as particularly usable and easily communicated instruments. People don't, by and large, like them or easily understand them, even if the right people manage to get their hands on them in the first place. So again, the advanced organizations are really thinking about this whole question of how do we do appropriate data extraction, and the more that we can move that, of course, into a system that actually enables direct communication to those who need to know, automated alerts and all those other benefits, really does then, of course, facilitate that quality of communication around the organization and removes the excuse that either I didn't see it, I didn't know, or I couldn't understand it. So I think all very important points, and Richard, maybe we can just pass to you again for a moment to give some thoughts and illustrations about just what impact automation can have in this area.
Sure. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, typically the contract lifecycle management applications are kind of broken into two parts. The first really being the steps we've covered would entail authoring, the creation of the agreement through the binding of that agreement with an electronic signature, as was mentioned. The next stage or the next component is typically a repository then. We've loaded all these agreements, and now in the transition phase, the key is that end users have visibility to those agreements, to know when to use the right contract, and also the people who are tasked with managing those agreements can track performance. So, one of the keys in structuring that repository repository to make it as effective, as searchable as it needs to be on an enterprise-wide basis is having the flexibility to apply a metadata structure to agreements. So that can include a variety of basic contract header details as well as more specific information about the various agreements. Things you're going to want to track, like the start and stop dates, so that you're aware in advance of when contracts are due to expire, and have the system create automated alerts in advance. And by putting this metadata structure in place up front, it really allows you a wide range of reporting capabilities on the back end to be able to then extract that data and track and monitor performance.
And picking up on that performance point, maybe we can skip to the next chart, which actually does talk specifically to that point about performance. And really three areas there that come out from our member surveys and discussions, that things that tend to go wrong. One is very much around KPIs. Now, there are many things we could say on KPIs, but first and foremost, I suppose, is the point that we should not try to overcomplicate things. The KPIs need to be very clearly tied into the key goals that are objectives, if you like, for having this relationship in the first place. If I can just give a simple example, let's assume for a moment that we were about to take a flight somewhere. Well, what would the KPIs be as far as we're concerned as passengers on that flight? Certainly one KPI, and probably the overwhelming one, is that we actually finish up safely at our destination, that we actually get to where we thought we wanted to go. But then there would also perhaps be some quality indicators that we might add into that would say, well, not only do we need to make sure we get there, but we need to get there feeling that, we've been well treated and respected or whatever. But the point is that there isn't an infinite number of KPIs. There are a number of other performance measures we might want to use. And of course, the key to good business management is that we try to operate within a manageable series of KPIs, and we also have, as far as possible, data which both sides agree is truth. One of the big problems we find with performance management is that the parties spend far too much of their time disagreeing over the facts. And again, technology, we're finding, has a tremendous role to play in trying to get both parties onto the same page so that they spend their time working out and resolving problems rather than pointing fingers and trying to allocate blame over the problem. I think the second big point is that of change management. And we know that today's volatile business environment is causing an increasing frequency of change, and that certainly any agreement that has duration beyond a few months is likely to see a number of significant changes occurring during its life cycle. In fact, the frequency of change management over the last 4 years has increased by about 30%. Yet the techniques and methods through which we manage change, track it, and record it have not really kept up with that level of demand. And in fact, another of the major areas of subsequent claim or dispute is around the change management procedure, or indeed whether a change was a change or whether it was properly agreed, etc. So that's a critical area for us to think about. How do we streamline? Again, the businesses are often frustrated by a long, laborious, bureaucratic change process, which doesn't really reflect the dynamism of business today. So there's always this temptation to perhaps agree changes informally by whatever means. It could be an email, it may even be through a social messaging type model, instant messenger or whatever, and everybody intends to properly record it, but they never quite get round to it. And of course that is then sowing the seeds for a later claim or dispute. And I suppose building from that is also the fact that we often need to recognize that we should be more thoughtful at the outset about the likelihood of significant change during the life cycle of the agreement. I'll give you an obvious example. If we're in an area like outsourcing, very often our year one objective is very clear. our key performance indicator, if you like, in the first year is we want to get substantial cost reduction. Maybe we even have a specific target. Maybe it's 20% cost reduction. That's very clear. We can work to it. There may be change management and disease along the way. But the real point is at the end of year one, our goals and objectives may change. It may be, for example, we now want to move into continuous improvement as opposed to cost reduction. And in year three, we may be looking for true innovation. Now, if we maintain the same KPIs and don't recognize the need to renegotiate aspects of that agreement, then of course the chances of succeeding in those later goals is dramatically reduced. And indeed, there are many pointers to show in many services agreements that that's exactly what happens. It starts well, but then there is subsequent disappointment. So we do need to think in advance and plan sometimes for specific milestones where renegotiation may actually be something that we commit to and expect as part of that contract life cycle. So let me again, if I may, I'll just sort of give you a comment opportunity there, Richard.
Thanks, Tim. And, when it comes to performance from a tool standpoint, certainly this software platform and contract lifecycle management helps track supplier performance against key performance indicators, service level agreements, and so on. But I'd also like to highlight performance more from an internal perspective, and it really comes down to compliance. Once the agreement's put in place, how is the organization doing in driving compliance with the utilization of that agreement? And here, this is where software can really help track, have we established the visibility and are we getting demand channeled to those approved vendor agreements that we put in place? And one quick way to track that is being able to look at contract utilization in this kind of stoplight fashion, red, yellow, and green, or red contract being actually overutilized, green, only partially utilized, to really highlight areas where maybe the actual utilization is trailing what was targeted for this point in the year. And from that view, be able to drill into actual line item transaction details to see what's being purchased in which quantities, and identify those opportunities for action, for change, just as you mentioned, Tim. So renegotiation could certainly come into play, for example, for that overutilized contract, because that means we're actually buying greater quantities than were forecast, so it probably means there's an opportunity to go back to that vendor to seek a price adjustment based on increased utilization.
And indeed, picking up on those points that you started with there, our next chart does, of course, talk about compliance. So our next chart just shows 4 other areas that members are talking about as being increasingly important in the world of contracting. Certainly compliance is one, but it isn't, of course, just the monitoring of absolute compliance. It's also about understanding the pressures for change, and particularly with the growth of more and more regulation, many contracts today are not operating in a static environment. And of course, if we are not compliant, we very much put at risk our reputation. And that, again, is something that the contracting organizations are increasingly expected to be very alert to. Now, another of the areas that we're seeing growing maturity in is the whole area of claim and dispute management. Claims, particularly in many companies today, are not really formally recorded, and as a result, of course, there's no real reporting, there's no real sense of the losses that may be getting generated. But more importantly, in a way, nor is there any indication of the quality issues, if you like, that those may be indicating. So, for example, if we're seeing repetitive sources of similar claim, then it's not very smart not to fix it. But if we're not actually capturing the data anywhere, then, of course, we're not even aware that it's happening. And we found that very, very few organizations have really done the systems development that's needed to have an efficient record of claims, a consolidated position that enables much better analytics and understanding of those quality issues as they occur. And finally, we've also, both of us, I think, already touched on this broader question of improvements in innovation. Areas like supplier relationship management, but also the need on the sell side to try to build incremental business to get greater value, better bottom line performance, says that this whole environment of trying to drive improvements in innovation through the contract life cycle is of very real importance today. Brandt, I would imagine you've seen a lot of this going on in your experiences, particularly I would imagine around those sort of compliance and reputation issues.
Oh, exactly. Under the umbrella of our Procurement Contract Administration Group, we have a vendor management office, which when it comes to managing performance is very instrumental in working with our product owners, our subject matter experts, and establishing roles and responsibilities for managing that performance. Now, in addition to my duties as Assistant General Counsel handling transactional matters for ERCOT, I'm also in a director role over our internal control management program. And so when compliance and guarding our reputation comes into play, it really goes to our system or our culture of compliance internally here at ERCOT, our corporate standards, our operating procedures that help ensure that we remain compliant in how we handle our contracts and how we deal with our contract partners. I know you mentioned previously the nimbleness of change orders and agreeing to amending an agreement by instant message, and that's one thing that would send shivers up the spines of anyone at ERCOT. We're very much geared towards a culture of compliance and formal processes, which the tool helps us in terms of instilling that discipline, in terms of following that process each time. But again, it's the tone at the top that is set at the organization here at ERCOT, and this culture of compliance that then has kind of grown out from under that and applies across the board, particularly to our contracting process.
So the system is meaning you've got less shivers up the spine there, eh?
Exactly.
Yeah. Richard, I know you had a brief comment on here, and I'm going to sort of push us along a little bit here, because it would be great to get to a few of the questions that have come in, but let me give you the chance to quickly comment as well.
Oh, thanks, Tim. From a tools perspective on the topic of governance, I think, as you look across the range of agreements that an organization puts in place, certainly some are basic, simple agreements to buy, commodity widgets, but more and more of these agreements are complex in nature and have ongoing performance obligations. So from a governance standpoint, it's important that the tools can help you, for instance, put in place milestone tracking. So here's an example of adding milestones, setting dates, and also identifying who those stakeholders are in the business that will be responsible for verifying that milestones are achieved, and the system then creating automated alerts to those verifiers to really be able to validate that the good or service, the result that was contracted for has been delivered. And the other thing that this accomplishes from a governance standpoint is avoiding the dreaded case of those evergreen agreements that auto-renew. And one question that comes up oftentimes is, how do I build a business case for contract management? There are a number of components, from process simplification, better risk management, and so on. But I've also seen cases where just the fact that if we hadn't had this agreement that no one knew about, that was evergreen, that auto-renewed, we would have saved more than enough money to pay for the investment. So that's a critical pain point as well.
Which again leads us neatly, I think, into our penultimate chart, and I'm just going to try and cover these final two very briefly, because they really are about this sort of, we've reached the end. And it's remarkable how many agreements have not, in fact, adequately addressed the whole question of how migration might occur. For example, the as Richard mentioned, with more and more fairly complex services agreements, we may need to move from supplier A to supplier B, but in order to do that, we may need the cooperation and collaboration of supplier A in doing it. There may be very specific aspects of intellectual property that need to get passed across, methods, procedures, etc. Failure to consider those, of course, puts us in a very big disadvantaged position and really puts the business at risk. And the same would apply if we're, of course, if we're looking at termination. Have we really been clear about the grounds on which termination will occur? And again, what residual properties or whatever might need to come back to us, what intellectual property rights might have been created in any works that have been undertaken, etc. So there needs to be plenty of upfront thinking, and unfortunately, often people avoid these unpleasant or difficult conversations at early phases and then live to regret it. And finally, we have, what did we learn? And recent research suggests that only 29% of organizations have a workable data capture system from which they actually learn from the experience of the contract they've undertaken. And not only is that a question, of course, of learning from each individual one, but it's also about the composite knowledge that we can gain by actually consolidating data and experience from across the portfolio of contracts we operate in, so that we learn the things that work and we avoid the things that don't. So this whole question of knowledge capture is, of course, critical to the overall value add that contracts organization can bring, and a relatively small proportion of them today are actually doing that. And they probably aren't going to improve very much without some form of automation. So, Richard, let me give the floor to you just to wrap things up, and hopefully we'll then get to a couple of questions.
Yes, Tim. So, an important part of the learning from a tools perspective is that this is a highly searchable repository, so that you can report on that. You can use a variety of either prepackaged or ad hoc reports. But equally important is the flexibility to do a simple keyword search across all agreements and all attachments. So an example here, a keyword, I'm searching for any agreement that contains the term third party, and I'm presented with agreements that may be for third-party logistics providers, for example. Alternatively, maybe I would have searched for rebates, because I want to know, are we capturing all the rebates that we've got coming to us? And in one fell swoop, I want to see across the enterprise all agreements that have the term rebate anywhere, again, in the master agreement or sub-agreements or attachments as well.
Very good. So, thank you. And I know that there's a live demo coming up for those who would like to participate and learn more about the Zycus solution and what this could offer to them in terms of contract lifecycle management. So while you're making a note of that, and you've got a link there that you can go to register for it, then, Rohan, I don't know if there are any questions that you want to select and pose at us.
Yes, Tim. So we have a few questions with us. So the first question is based on our panelists' experience. What are the 3 KPIs you would suggest for an efficient contract management?
Yes, Richard, I don't know if you want to start with that one. The question, I think, Rohan, was 3 KPIs as it relates to the investment in contract management software, or just generally what are KPIs that one should use in contract management?
Yeah, and Tim, I guess this is Richard jumping in from a tools standpoint. It's a little bit difficult to answer just because the tools are built to have enough flexibility that the KPIs might vary from agreement to agreement or category or type of agreement where different KPIs are the most appropriate for that particular one. So if it's, if it were a technology purchase and KPIs were established around system uptime and availability, response times, those kinds of things, backup and redundancy, then they would be specific to that agreement type. So I think the tools have really been designed to allow maximum flexibility to structure the most appropriate KPIs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. KPIs are, of course, typically going to be driven by the buyer around the buyer's priorities, and it's up to the seller, of course, to ask the right intelligent questions to really make sure they've got clarity over what the real priorities are. But at the same time, you know, the buyer is the one ultimately who has to really try to prioritize within what may often be a fairly complex and sometimes even somewhat contradictory set of KPIs based upon which stakeholder you speak to. But, I mean, sometimes it's very obvious. Sometimes it's a KPI that's driven very much by time. For example, you know, if you're looking at building an Olympic stadium, then having it delivered a week after the Olympics are due to start is not going to work very well. So there you tend to have the advantage of a very clear and absolute KPI of it must be available for, you know, 1st of July of 2000 whatever. And there is plenty of evidence that suggests that the simpler the KPIs, the more likely that they're achieved. Now, I think I mentioned before, I wouldn't start with KPIs. I'd start with making sure there's absolute clarity over what are the goals behind this acquisition. You know, who is really driving it? Who is the owner of this? Who is the ultimate arbiter, if you like, of its success? And what are the specific goals that they've got in mind? And the KPIs should absolutely be driving to those particular objectives. Brandt, anything you'd like to add to that?
No, I think I just echo the same sentiments that, you know, the KPIs I believe would be very dependent on the specific contract that was being contemplated and then negotiated. I think it's very specific in that regard.
Okay, so we have another question here. It says that how to rate contracts depending on the risks associated with them.
So, Richard, I don't know if you want to start with that one again.
Yeah, you know, I think in terms of the tools perspective, you know, you might choose to flag certain agreements for increased scrutiny or attention based on some assessment of potential risk. You know, you're certainly going to put in place more milestones, structure a variety of reports and dashboard alerts for those agreements that are deemed to have, you know, potentially higher risk, because again, as you look across the gamut of goods and services, certainly some are less risky, more standard commodity purchases, and others have more priority. So that there would be an assignment of relative risk and appropriate levels of scrutiny attached through the interface of the tool.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we're certainly seeing a real maturing of risk assessment technique these days. One certainly is based on agreement types. Clearly, for example, a joint venture is much more risky inherently than a commodity acquisition agreement. Those are extreme examples, of course. But as you go across the spectrum of relationship types, there are greater levels of riskiness across that spectrum. I think the other point, though, is that we're seeing organizations increasingly also looking to capture and analyze it relative to the terms and conditions themselves, and to have, if you like, risk barometers that are based upon the levels and nature of the deviation from their standard enabled terms. And there are two aspects to risk there. One is obviously the damage that could occur to the business, for example, reputational risk, or from a very onerous limitation of liabilities clause. So you have those what may be often fairly theoretical risks that only really occur if things go wrong. But then you also have, I think, growth of understanding that there are very real economic consequences in some other terms that will cause much more likelihood of risks occurring, or of, if you like, negative events occurring. So organizations are trying to look, I think, more at a structure that says what level of variation to us is acceptable, and when does something, if you like, cross a red line of riskiness. It doesn't mean we don't accept it, but obviously it does increase the possibility that things will not work out, that we will not perform, and in failing to perform, of course, all sorts of risks can accrue. So those would be a couple of my specific comments, and Again, those are things that can be managed without systems, but are clearly much better managed with systems. And the organizations, I think, that are really leading on this are certainly moving down that systems-based path. Brandt, I'm sure that risk is very much uppermost in your mind, given your role in the business.
Well, it is, although now I'm mindful of the risk of us overstaying our welcome with our attendees.
Yes, I do think we're out of time, but a very robust discussion today, and the day, or multiple days, but hopefully fewer days from a contracting cycle time standpoint than had been in the past with some of these best practices and tools. So wanted to thank everyone for participating. Thanks to our panel, Brandt and Tim, thanks so much for this enlightening tour of the day in life of the contract.